Today, we are thrilled to have Sean Adam and Kabir Shahani here to introduce us to the Rural Development Network's Sustainable Housing Initiative. Sean is a community planner whose role has focused primarily on conducting extensive planning research and analysis, facilitating community engagement, and developing housing strategies and reports for rural municipalities in Alberta. Kabir is the manager for Housing Strategy and Research, who is passionate about addressing Canada's rural and remote housing crisis through supporting development of affordable housing in underserved communities. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Sean and Kabir, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for hosting us here. Really excited to present on housing choice in rural Alberta. So, my name's Kabir, and Sean is joining me as well for this presentation. And I'm just going to talk about a bit about what the Rural Development Network does, and then also we're going to tie it into the retention of health professionals in rural areas. So, firstly, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Mohawk peoples, or present day Montreal, and Sean is joining us from Treaty 6 territory, or present day Edmonton. I wanted to also acknowledge that both these places have been a gathering space since time immemorial for First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people across Turtle Island. One thing I was thinking about also when I was writing this land acknowledgement is how can this kind of relate to the work that we're doing at the Rural Development Network, and particularly the initiative that we work in, the Sustainable Housing Initiative. And I wanted to do that through highlighting a project that I'm going to talk about in this presentation that is kind of tied to our journey through reconciliation in the affordable housing space. So first, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we do at the Rural Development Network, what our vision is. As you can see on the slide, our vision is thriving rural communities. It's only 3 words, but that's really what we want. It's pretty simple, and that's kind of the goal of the organization. We really try and work with communities and partners, and build networks and build capacity by developing tools and resources, implementing projects, facilitating access to funding and trusted data, while amplifying the rural voice. So our organization was started in Alberta, and now we've expanded to be a national organization. We work across Canada in the provinces and territories. And we've also kind of expanded our mandate to work in remote communities as well. And we're identifying new challenges there, and we're seeing how that can connect with rural areas. And these are really summed up into the 4 things that we work on. So, developing innovative tools and resources, expertise and capacity building, advocacy and amplifying the rural voice. And then we help rural communities and then rural nonprofit organizations access funding across Canada. And we're also, I don't know if I mentioned that, but we're also a nonprofit organization. So our we have that lens, and we try and work through a lens of representing rural Canada. So I'll just talk a little bit about our key program areas as an organization as a whole. So Sean and I work in supporting housing development. That's one of the key areas. And right now, in Canada, it's a big issue, and everyone's talking about it. So we work on those types of topics. Homelessness is also a big one. We have a team that works on that, and they go into communities, provide homelessness estimations. They really try and help understand what the situation is in rural communities so that it can be presented to, audience that has access to funding, and they can address the crisis of homelessness. Another thing that we do that would be kind of relevant to what RPAP does is we integrate and retain newcomers. We work on that. We work on integrating and retaining newcomers in rural communities. So we have a rural immigration initiative that does a lot of that work, and they release some interesting reports and go into communities and do some interesting projects. And then we do general community development in many different ways through a rural lens. So now I'll talk a little bit about the initiative that Sean and I work in, the Sustainable Housing Initiative, or we call it SHI. And we just work with communities, nonprofits to really help with their affordable housing journey. And then we also do research on the side as well, which we'll talk about more today. These are all of the supports and services. So one of the big ones is data collection and needs assessments. Today, a needs assessment is like a housing needs assessment is a document that really illustrates what the needs are in the community, how we can address them. It uses statistical analysis as well as it can include surveys with from respondents. And we found that in rural communities, like there isn't much data for this, and a lack of data leads to a lack of funding and a lack of identifying the issue. So that's something that we're really working towards uncovering. We do policy development as well. So in the housing space, we help with action plans and we help with municipalities and indigenous communities kind of developing their own strategies for housing. Um, we help communities, or we work with communities to access funding for their projects. So we kind of serve as that connector between them and other big sources of funding. And we try and address the capacity needs through that. We do consultation strategy, and we also provide workshops and training for people in rural communities to help kind of understand how to access funding for affordable housing, but also how the development process works as a whole. So right now, I'll just go into a quick thing on one of our main documents, one of our guiding documents for the initiative, the step-by-step guide to developing affordable housing. So we released this in 2023. It was our second edition of the guide. It was informed by a national advisory committee. It included updates from the last edition, and it brought clarity to the affordable housing development process. So I think in this from your point of view, from your perspective, the really cool thing about this guide was there was a lot of consultation on accessibility in housing and aging in place in housing, and just generally how we can in rural communities how we can have people feel comfortable in their homes and not have to, I guess, not have to move to a larger city to access housing when they don't want to. Just pretty much how they can have housing that fits their needs. So this was a pretty interesting one, and it was funded by the CMHC, the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, as well as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and a few other partners here that are listed on the screen. What's cool about this is what came out of it. We started this affordable housing course, which is an asynchronous, collaborative, informative, and interactive course, which is actually now open for registration. This is a pretty good resource that we've done, which is it's all video modules that are animated. And it's fully there to just have people connect with each other from across the country while also providing general knowledge about the affordable housing development process. It's a pretty quick way to really like understand a holistic view of what's going on right now and how to get started on a project, how to maintain a project, things like that. And now coming back to this part, which I talked about earlier on in the land acknowledgement, it's the First Nation-led guide to developing affordable housing. So I talked about the step-by-step guide to developing affordable housing earlier. That guide received a lot of it was really popular in the affordable housing community, and there was a lot of talk about, okay, like we like this guide, but we want something that is for Indigenous communities specifically. At the time when we had done the guide, we didn't have the capacity to do an Indigenous-led document. So we did some scoping and we assembled a team, and we decided, we would do a First Nations-led document, and we would do two separate guides that were on reserve for on-reserve populations, and then for off-reserve First Nation populations. So we really highlighted the importance of it being First Nation led, to discuss barriers and to develop solutions. And then, if there's a like housing on reserve and off reserve is completely different, just based on like, I guess, bylaw and all of these different factors, right? Where development is done in a completely different way. And then through this, we've created a scoping document. This was funded by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation as well. We created a scoping document. We're on to our next phase, where we're still trying to await our funding confirmation for the guides to be developed. But it's a pretty interesting document that's kind of like one of those things that people say that it's like people say that it's really needed. have that, but it's also really complicated because every nation does things differently. Um, so we've started that, and then the cool thing about that was that, and it's actually really relevant for this presentation. We recently finished up with a collaboration with nursing students at Grant MacEwan University, and we wanted to have their input on how housing impacts the social determinants of health, or how it is a social determinant of health. And they really provided a lot of info on how, if you're living in housing that's, I guess, substandard housing, you can have a lot of respiratory issues in the future. Housing also impacts your mental health, so it can lead to certain types of diseases in the future. So pretty much, this is kind of why, like this is kind of interesting, because it's like housing and health. Like, you don't really think about it as much, but when you put them together, it's like it makes a big difference. Like, if you grow up in a house that is a that is a nice house and a nice place to live versus a house that has a lot of problems, or if you grew up without access to a home, your trajectory of life can be completely different in terms of your health. So that's another reason why developing affordable housing is important. Now I'm going to pass it off to Sean over here, and Sean's going to talk more about the work that he's doing in rural Alberta.
Thank you, Kabir, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Sean. I'm a community planner here at RDN, and my role over the past few years has been working extensively on a project called the Enabling Housing Choice Project. And we recently wrapped it up. It was a 3-year research project that was really aimed at examining various housing issues, barriers, and opportunities that are specific to rural Alberta communities. And then we worked with 6 different communities to create local solutions to help them meet the specific housing needs in each of their communities. Now, before I dive in, I do just want to put it out there that maybe not all of this information is going to be necessarily relevant to your field, but that the reality is that for many rural municipalities, they're struggling right now to retain workers from all fields. And that's largely in part due to housing availability, affordability, and also housing suitability. And so if this is currently impacting you or others you know, I do just want to encourage everybody to become an advocate for housing diversity and housing affordability, because that's really what the Enabling Housing Choice Project is all about. Now, the next few slides here are essentially our research methodology and timeline for the EHC project. So I'll go over them fairly quickly. And if you have any questions about our methodology or the approaches we took, please feel free to bring them up in the Q&A portion at the end of this presentation. But essentially, the Enabling Housing Choice Project went through 4 phases. And the first was called the preliminary research phase, where we gathered as much information as we could from rural communities across Alberta to understand the various factors that are currently impacting housing development. Now, this first phase produced 5 preliminary reports that outlined a variety of different housing issues, barriers, and perceptions around housing that are currently prevalent across rural Alberta. And if you're interested in looking at some of those 5 reports, they are available on our RDN website. But that brought us into the second phase of the project, which we called policy implementation, where we invited communities from the first phase to apply, to partner with us to conduct more in-depth research in their communities, engage with their communities, and help them ultimately enable more housing diversity. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, we partnered with 6 different communities to study and understand their specific housing situations and completed these project partnerships in the fall of 2023. And in that phase, we would generally produce 2 different reports for each of our partner communities. So these would be what we heard reports based on the community engagement we conducted. It would summarize essentially everything we heard from those that we would interview or survey. And then we'd use a lot of that local information to inform what we called our recommendations reports for the partner communities, which would typically detail and outline a variety of different solutions or approaches that they could adopt to enable more diverse housing development in their communities. In the last 2 phases, phases 3 and 4, we essentially took all of our findings from the first two phases and used it to create what is called our guidebook for diversifying housing in rural communities. And I will be talking about that guide a little later in this presentation. And yeah, and we'll get to that a bit later. But the 6 communities that we partnered with in Alberta were the town of Mayorsthorpe. And sorry, I believe that's on the next slide, Kabir. Thank you. And the town of Mayorthorpe was certainly our most northern municipality that we partnered with. And then we also partnered with the city of Airdrie, which was certainly the most populous. And then the rest of the communities were all very much in southern Alberta. These included the towns of Pincher Creek, Trochu, Claresholm, and the town of Bow Island. And these communities would typically range in population from just under 1,000 in Trochu to just over 80,000 in the city of Airdrie. And as you can see, our goal for the Enabling Housing Choice Project was pretty high level. But what we connected with this goal is our thinking that as rural communities are able to diversify the types of housing in their community and increase housing choice, that housing affordability will also be positively affected. And let's just take a minute here because I've been talking about housing diversity and housing choice a lot. So I want to encourage everybody here today to think about what housing diversity means to you, because this was a question that we typically ask everybody in our community engagement process. And on this slide here, you can see some of their answers. And when you read through them, you'll see that housing diversity, not surprisingly, will mean different things to different people. And I'm guessing that your answer for what housing diversity means to you is probably a variation of one of these here on the screen. And so we discovered that housing diversity is very dependent on your perspective, whether you're a housing developer, a resident, housing agency, property manager, tenant, municipality, or housing advocate. But what's clear to us is that housing diversity is complex. And the kind of common underlying theme here is that people often connect this idea of housing diversity with housing affordability. So the next question is, why is housing diversity so important? Well, we suggest that by providing a greater variety of housing choice in a community, that the housing needs of an increasingly diverse array of residents and household types can be met. And so here on the slide here are just a few of the positive impacts that can be realized when you increase housing diversity in a community, because it can allow for a broader range of residents with a variety of income levels, backgrounds, cultures, and lifestyles. And that broader range of residents helps to support a wider variety of business, because of course, businesses need housing for their workers. And so if you're in the healthcare business, or if you're a rural health professional, this is absolutely huge, because hospitals, care centers, medical facilities, and clinics will struggle to sustain themselves if there's not enough housing in the community to support those who work there. And so housing diversity really helps with that retention of existing residents and also attracting new residents, because it provides options for both to help communities sustain themselves and grow. And so just as an example of that, say you're a young person, maybe you're 18 years old, you've just finished high school, and you want to get out of mom and dad's home, but you're not maybe ready to move to a different community or a different city, and you just want to stay in the town. Having a more smaller or affordable housing type, even something as easy as an accessory suite or a basement suite, that can be really advantageous for young people who, again, just want to have their own independence. And on the other end of the age spectrum, you have retirees and seniors, and they can be both from within the community or from the surrounding municipality, but perhaps they want to downsize and they need something that's more age friendly so that they can continue to live comfortably in their community. Whatever it is, the bottom line is that housing diversity really facilitates everything here that you see on the screen. So again, attracting and retaining newcomers, keeping people in the community, and that helps make it more stable and sustainable. But the real question is, how do we start to understand a community's diverse housing needs? To me, and my thought on this is that it really begins with conducting extensive and also meaningful community engagement. And so throughout the Enabling Housing Choice project, we focused on that idea of meaningful community engagement. And our engagement objectives were essentially threefold. Where we wanted to understand and document what are people's thoughts, preconceptions, and concerns, both about general local housing issues and housing diversity in particular. The second is that we wanted to gather as much information as we could from a wide variety of stakeholders about their experiences in providing and looking for housing in the community, and to further understand what are their challenges and barriers, and what do they see as opportunities for developing housing in those communities. And the third one, and this was really important to us as well, we wanted to look at ways in which we could increase support for housing diversity in the communities we worked with, but also have to just really foster more community buy-in and support for diverse housing development. And so, as I may have touched on already, this sort of information we would gather through a variety of different processes. And this would generally include community surveys. So if you wanted to really, tackle the community at large, we would often distribute a survey through social media platforms or through local municipal administration to really get as much feedback as we could from a wide variety of community residents. But then we would also kind of dial in and focus our engagement more specifically in terms through interviews and focus group discussions. And so we would often invite a wide variety of housing stakeholders to these interviews and discussions. And this would include local housing developers and builders, municipal staff. So this could include planners, council members, economic development officers, or local housing committees. And also, again, passionate or residents that really just wanted to be involved in the process, or local businesses and employers. And the results of that community engagement process with each community would generally be summarized into a What We Heard report for all of the partner communities. So if you want to see what some of the feedback is in rural communities, and if you are from one of those communities that we partnered with, you can look at those What We Heard reports on our website. But I'm just going to give a brief summary of some of the key items that people would talk about across the 6 different communities. And so right in the middle there, you'll see, and it's maybe not surprising, that often respondents felt there was just a need for more housing in general, and also more particularly more rental housing. And so maybe you kind of noticed that these are general needs that are often in the news, and you see it often in cities like Edmonton and Calgary. But I want to reiterate that it's important to realize that these needs are recognized as very much a rural issue as they are an urban issue. Now, in terms of the other particular types of housing that people wanted or felt was needed in their communities, was again not really surprising. Often they would say, we need more affordable housing. We need more smaller types of housing, those with fewer bedrooms, or we need more accessible housing. And also more attached forms of housing. So this could be, townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, etc. And in terms of those who would benefit from these sort of additional, smaller, and more affordable housing types, respondents indicated that they felt retirees and seniors would really benefit, as well as newcomers to the community, and single people who were especially in need of housing. Because again, these smaller attached housing forms is typically generally more suitable and more affordable for those groups. But the bottom line, really what we took away from this community engagement process, is that people in rural communities are really dialed into their needs for housing, and they understand that housing diversity is important and that they want it. And so, as stated earlier, we did want to really understand the barriers and challenges to building housing in these rural communities, because this could help us inform the strategies that we'd come up with to overcome those barriers. So the challenges were apparent in varying degrees in all of the partner communities, but you can generally summarize them under these kind of 4 categories here on the screen. The first would be housing industry issues, those generally experienced by people looking to build housing or develop housing. And so developers and builders would often say, okay, the biggest barrier for us is upfront development costs, as well as the servicing and infrastructure costs or municipal taxes. but also just in general, the availability of land to develop on, and also the availability of skilled workers in the community or trades workers to help complete the construction. On the municipal governance end, and we hear this from both sides, kind of like in the internal municipal administrative people that we talk to, as well as those kind of working in the private industry. But they felt that sometimes municipal policies and municipal bylaws could act as impediments to diverse housing development, where maybe there was like few or no incentives for home builders or homeowners to actually construct a house. Another thing, and this one, um, it's quantifiable, but they would say, well, sometimes there's poor communication or relationships between developers and or home builders and the municipal administration. And this could just halt or delay projects if they didn't have that ongoing transparent communication. Another challenge was that often these rural municipalities struggle to have enough staff capacity to enact any changes to policy or bylaws and really take action on housing initiatives in their community. So capacity, generally speaking, is always one of the biggest challenges in any rural community. In that same vein, the planning and development challenges and issues we'd often hear about is that there's often quite a lot of red tape barriers and lengthy development processes. So if you're a developer or home builder, any time is money, right? And so anytime you have an elongated development process or something is delayed, that's essentially just increasing your risk and can cost you more money. And on the regulatory side of things, sometimes land use restrictions in the land use bylaw can make it really difficult to build houses that will differ from this traditional single detached. Quite often in these rural communities, traditional single detached are pretty much surefire permitted use in a lot of zones. But if you want to build something that's multifamily or attached forms, it can just take a little longer to get through that development process, or it just might not even be allowed in that zone at all. And the last kind of challenge category was community opposition. And again, I feel this one really just reinforces that idea of the importance of having meaningful community engagement, educational and informational opportunities for the community, because NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, while in some cases, certainly concerns around different housing types can certainly be warranted. In a lot of other times, NIMBYism can halt or entirely just stop dead in the tracks any sort of diverse housing development proposal, and can have negative impacts on the community and negative impacts on developers and builders who want to build there. And so, yeah, there's often all sorts of challenges and resistance to change. And sometimes there's fears around bringing newcomers to the community and new forms of housing. And that's why, again, we advocate for community engagement and these sorts of informational opportunities to help kind of just reduce that community resistance. And so, yeah, those housing challenges and needs are generally what we heard across the board in the communities that we work with. And what was really important to us before addressing these challenges and those needs was to gain a more holistic understanding of the community's housing landscape, and again, their overall needs, in order to identify appropriate and locally relevant housing solutions and opportunities that can be seized. And so, as Kabir was talking about earlier, housing needs assessment. These are a great quantitative tool that can provide a statistical analysis of a community's housing stock. But when that sort of statistical housing data is coupled with the more qualitative approaches that we take in this Enabling Housing Choice project, so surveys, interviews, or open houses, this allows us to really understand if a community's perception of their housing needs aligns with some of those statistics that we'd obtain from a housing needs assessment and vice versa. And from there, once we have a better understanding of their needs, challenges, and aspirations for housing, we'll work closely and collaborate with municipal administration to develop solutions that are locally relevant and meet their housing needs, and begin to address some of those challenges that I was talking about earlier. So these solutions typically would take the form of some form of housing policy update or updates to housing related regulations or land use bylaws to create a more permissive and a more flexible planning environment that can accommodate different housing types. And so I know I've kind of already done it already, and I won't get into the really super technical, like nerdy planner explanations of how all communities can go about creating a more permissive and flexible planning environment. But if you do have any questions or curiosities about some of those more in-depth solutions that we proposed, you can ask us at the end of this presentation. I'm always happy to talk about it. Now, the third sort of overarching category that you see on the right of the screen here, when it comes to creating diverse housing solutions, is that we strongly encourage our partner communities to maintain momentum and keep the conversation about housing diversity going. And so again, that's why conducting continual community engagement cannot be stressed enough. For example, we might encourage our communities to create a local housing development board or committee, often comprised of residents, business owners, realtors, and developers and administration, to keep that ongoing discussion about housing in the community going. And also for them to kind of get together and set actions and set goals that they want to reach for housing. And so I want to take this moment to encourage all of you, if you do have a local housing development committee or a community development committee or something of that nature, and you want to be an advocate for housing diversity and speak up, I would encourage you to look into joining one of them if they allow local community residents to be a part of them. I think it's a really great way to keep housing in that ongoing discussion in the community. Now, before I move on to discuss the guidebook that I was mentioning earlier, I do just want to discuss some of the collaborative recommendations that we prepared for the town of Bow Island, because we were really excited to conduct a land use study on a parcel of land called the Westview Lands that is currently seeking to construct a new continuing care facility on the parcel. And so once we knew this, we thought it was really critical and important for us to engage with the community in Bow Island, as well as their administration and elected officials, to understand what types of housing can we develop on this parcel to best serve the healthcare professionals that would have to be moving to Bow Island to work at the facility. And so, taking into account everything that we heard through the community engagement process with Bow Island, we proposed to the town to zone the parcel to allow for an array of housing types, including low-rise apartments, townhouses, duplexes, and single detached, just to accommodate the diverse needs of the different workers that may one day work at that care facility. And we were excited to see that Bow Island also recently received funding from CMHC's Housing Accelerator Fund to assist with the servicing and infrastructure costs of these lots. And so, yeah, we're very excited that when the care facility is constructed, to know that there will be housing made available for the healthcare professionals that will be working there. Now, I do just want to shift gears and talk with you about a recently released guidebook for diversifying housing in rural communities, which is really a summation of all our projects, research, partnerships, and experiences combined into one guidebook resource. And I just want to share with you how we approach developing this guidebook. So what we did is essentially we divided it into 8 separate modules, because if you're like me, and you don't enjoy downloading a 100-page PDF to just gain access to only a few pages of relevant information, then perhaps the moduled approach we felt would really just allow communities to more easily access information that's important to them. So I'm just going to briefly go over the first 3 modules that we created, where in the first, it's essentially just an overview of our entire project timeline and process, including the different methodologies and approaches we took prior to developing the guide. In the subsequent modules 2 and 3, we then further explore what we mean when we're talking about housing diversity and why it's important in any community, no matter how big or small. But more importantly, we also looked at the ways in which communities can start to identify their own diverse housing needs and begin to get a stronger sense of their own housing landscape. And so while those first 2 modules really captured our approach to exploring housing diversity and the ways in which we can identify those needs, the real meat and potatoes of this guide is found within modules 4 and 6, which, as I was talking about earlier, they kind of cover the different approaches to exploring housing policy incentives, land use bylaw updates, and again, looking at how community engagement, collaboration, and capacity building are really integral catalysts to taking action on your community's housing needs. I won't go into the seventh module of the guide. It's essentially an evaluation framework. That's quite complex, but essentially, if you were a community that wanted to use that evaluation framework, you could use it to look at how impactful your various housing actions, initiatives, or policies have been in your community. But what I do want to focus on here is the eighth module of our guide, which is really intended to be a starting point for any municipality that's exploring or looking to refine their current housing policy incentives. Essentially what it is, it's just a compendium of current housing policy incentives that municipalities across Alberta have adopted to promote housing development in their communities. Now, I realize I probably didn't actually explain maybe what a housing policy incentive is, but think of it as any form of, say, tax or monetary incentive that you can provide to a housing developer or builder that will really help eliminate some of the upfront costs for them and essentially entice them to come build or develop in your community. But what I do want to mention about this compendium is that in no way is it an exhaustive list, because it primarily focuses on Alberta towns and cities that have a population of under 100,000. But I think it's a really great way to equip communities with different ideas and inspirations for how different policy incentive approaches can look, and to allow them to essentially find policies that have been adopted by other Albertan municipalities that are similar in size and population to their own. So yeah, that's my plug for the guidebook, and I encourage you to check it out on our website. And if you have any questions about the guide, feel free to email myself or Kabir, and we're always happy to chat more about that. Now, in other news, both Kabir and I are very excited to announce that we did receive additional funding from the Alberta Real Estate Foundation to continue the Enabling Housing Choice project in Alberta's northern rural communities. And in this project, we're going to be really leaning on all the experiences and knowledge that we gained from the first project. And we're really excited to just essentially hone the process and approach, and can't wait to continue the project with new communities. And so we did recently finish, it was actually on Monday, we finished our first call out for partner municipalities and are looking to conduct interviews with them, with those that applied from now till right before Christmas. But that being said, if you are part of a municipality and you think something like the Enabling Housing Choice project could be really advantageous to you and your community in Northern Alberta, and you missed the application deadline, we are extending it for communities that reach out to us to December 16th. So it's not too late to potentially be a part of this project. But nevertheless, keep an eye out in the new year to see if your community has been accepted as a new partner for this project. And we'll be posting and sharing progress over the next year or so with the communities. And we'll also then be updating our guidebook to reflect the learnings that we obtained from this project, just to ensure that the guide is relevant and useful for Alberta's most northerly communities. And I should also say, I don't think it's in the link tree that we have at the end here, but if you want access to that application form for the EHC North project, reach out to me and we can provide it to you. Nevertheless, I do want to thank all of you again for attending our presentation today. And if you'd like to review or download any of the reports or the guidebook that I was talking, it's on the link tree at the end here, also on the website shown at the bottom of the slide here. But we also have a lot of other great resources, as was shown on the last slide here. As Kabir was talking about, the guide to developing affordable housing, there's a guide for estimating homelessness, path for housing cooperatives, and one of my favorites, which is called Placemaking for Inclusion. It's a guide to tenant-based initiatives, looking at ways you can promote more social inclusion and participation between those living in affordable housing and the broader community. Yes, thank you again so much. We're now happy to take any questions that you may have.
Yeah, we did have a question come in through the Q&A. So it says, Whistler Housing Authority offers affordable housing for workers. reduce sale price, and they assess resale price when they sell to keep it affordable. And have a list of requirements, such as cannot own property elsewhere, must reside X number of months a year, must work X hours in the community, etc. Have you seen this happening anywhere in Alberta?
I can't necessarily because Whistler is probably somewhat of an anomalous community in BC in the sense that it's just so tourist heavy. I would say, of course, you would presume that kind of the equivalent communities here in Alberta would be Banff, Jasper, or Canmore. I'm not entirely well versed in the sorts of housing initiatives that are taking in Banff or Jasper. There's one it's kind of adjacent, somewhat related, that there's a secondary suite incentive offered in Canmore with strict rules about the occupation of those secondary suites. But yeah, I'm sorry, I wish I could answer that question better. I'd have to familiarize myself more with Whistler's initiative. But yeah, sorry, I don't have much more to offer than that.
I can also add in a bit too on that. In Alberta, I haven't really seen any projects that have like come up that have that kind of system. In other provinces, there are a few projects that are either rent to own projects where the person comes in, rents for a certain amount, and then is able to purchase the property with, you know, some of the amount that they've paid in their rent. So there are projects like that, and then there is also a few other projects that are like kind of like what you've described in Whistler, where they're direct ownership, but it's controlled where they've got to be there for a certain amount of time, or they have to put like there's restrictions on it. But I've seen it in other communities, haven't really seen it in Alberta. But it doesn't mean it can't happen in Alberta.
I am from Central Alberta, Red Deer, and I am from Catholic Social Services. I'm housing coordinator. We normally welcome newcomers, and housing is our main struggle. Mostly renting. My question is, like I have on diversity. We have a lot of question when it's come to like buying ethical based finance. Like some of our clients, they come from, they have different view. Like they will not religion. It's not allowed to them to take interest, and we have some institution in the market which they're asking a lot of money. Like they're asking for 25 to 20, like almost 50% of the, and nobody can afford at this time. And buying house or getting house is everybody's dream. Do you guys have any suggestion for this kind of people?
Yep. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So it's actually really interesting. There is this program right now, this research, it's like a research study that I don't know if it's still active or if it, like I know it started a couple years ago. It's called the Halal Housing Lab. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but I believe that it was started by the Islamic Families Association of Alberta or of Edmonton. It's IFSSA, I think. It's called the Halal Housing Lab, and it was funded by the CMHC. They're looking at ways of doing of doing. I guess they're trying to like there is like the traditional way of mortgages and how they work, and then there's some institutions now that are doing halal financing, but like you're saying, it's very prohibitive, right? Because the cost is exponentially high. So they're looking at ways to kind of figure out how they can bring groups together to have this to allow people to purchase homes. So it would be interesting. You can check them out. Yeah, and I mean, I think that they also do collaborate on their projects as well.
Yeah, thank you. Like local government, also the provincial government, also working on that since election, but no progress yet. Probably that is a campaigning tool, but hopefully we'll see something positive. Thank you, though. I'll check on that.
Sounds good.
Right. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to Sean and Kabir for sharing. This information has given us a lot to think about, and the more information that we have, the better equipped we are to build capacity in our communities and support everyone, no matter where they are in their journey for housing. And so thank you again for all of this information.